to say welcome and a very big thank you for joining this call today. We recognise that it's a really busy time for everybody trying to balance ongoing projects and tasks with new challenges. So we're really grateful that you've prioritised this event on your calendars. For those who I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, my name is Rachel Smith. I recently joined INEE as the project manager for this project and also as a focal point for all things PSS and SEL. So Margie, if we could move to the agenda slide, that's great, thank you. So after a brief introduction to our speakers, I'm going to pass to Margie, who's going to situate this project within INEE's work on PSS and SEL more broadly. And then we're going to hear from Sylvia about what is the need for this project and the goals and outcomes before handing over to Sonia and Stephanie from our partner at Harvard's EASEL lab. I'm then going to highlight how INEE will work with its partner throughout this project. And then Julia is going to talk us through the timeline and the next steps to move this project forward. And then we will round off the call with a Q&A session at the end. Next slide, please. So today you're going to hear from the two partners involved in this project, INEE and Harvard's EASEL lab. On the INEE side, we have Margie Bart, who you all know, the Education Policy Coordinator, myself, who I've just introduced, and then we have our two co-conveners for the PSS-SEL collaborative. So Sylvia, who is also the Associate Director of Education Research at IRC, and Julia, who is an Education in Emergencies Advisor with Save the Children. Then from our partners at Harvard's EASEL lab, we're going to hear from Stephanie Jones, who is a Professor of Childhood Development and Education and the Director of EASEL lab, and Sonia Temko, who is our International Projects Coordinator. Rebecca Bailey is also heavily involved in this project, although she's not able to join the call today. I'm now going to pass over to Margie, who's going to do the INEE introduction. Thank you, Margie.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel. So as many of you know, psychosocial support and social emotional learning has been a priority working area within INEE since 2013. The INEE working group members from the 2014-2017 cohort formed a subgroup to specifically dedicate attention to PSS and SEL to address gaps in policy, practice, and research related across the education emergency landscape. This subgroup of members oversaw the development and publication of two foundational documents related to PSS and SEL. Many of you are familiar with these. It's the background paper and the guidance notes, which were published in 2014 and 2018. The 2018 to 2020 INEE working group cohort established the PSS-SEL collaborative, as it's now known, and sought to continue the efforts of the previous subgroup. The collaborative is made up of 18 agencies. Some of them are practitioners, some policymakers, donors, researchers, all working together with an interagency approach. Since the collaborative members convened in 2018, the collaborative has already overseen the development, publication, and uptake of the INEE training module on PSS and SEL. And they've also worked on a landscape review on teacher well-being with the INEE Teachers in Crisis Context Group as well. So all four of these resources, the background paper, the guidance note, the training module, and the landscape review are all available on the INEE website if you'd like to take a look. In early 2019, the collaborative members identified a critical gap in PSS and SEL in education emergencies. They realized that while there is more emphasis placed on stakeholders across the sector to address well-being for children affected by conflict and crisis, there's an absence of a global PSS and SEL framework, a framework that highlights the underpinnings of the skills and competencies necessary for children and young people to thrive. So over the last year and a half, the collaborative members have been hard at work and have been able to secure buy-in and funding to be able to fill this gap. Thanks to support largely from the Porticus Foundation, here we are kicking off this 2-year project to develop a core and adaptive framework for PSS and SEL for the sector. This interagency effort by the collaborative and our partners at Harvard EASEL Lab will build common language across the sector and support programming, monitoring and evaluation, policymaking, and research to build evidence. You'll hear more from Sylvia about the project goals and outcomes in just a moment. I just wanted to emphasize that PSS and SEL has been an important part of I&E's work, and the Core Framework Project, which we'll talk about today, falls within I&E Strategic Priority Area 3, which is to provide, curate, and organize knowledge to inform policy and practice. As well as you can see, it spans across all of our thematic areas of work as well. And we're really excited to be able to add the framework to our list of PSS and SEL open resources for the sector. Back to you, Rachel. I think I hand it off to Sylvia now. Is that right?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. So as Margie mentioned, we, the collaborative at I&E, had identified that there's a big problem in the field, which is the absence of a global PS and SEL framework. This is a critical gap that is impacting policy, funding, and program decision making. We have seen that there's a big issue, and is that the field of PSS and SEL has not really clearly defined the dimensions and the skills that it studies, or its connection with dimensions and competencies that are relevant for other related subfields like violence prevention, peace education, citizenship education, 21st centuries education. There are many fields that have similar dimensions, similar skills, but it's not clearly defined. Often we find that people use the same name to refer to different skills, or use different names to refer to the same skill, and that has created really a lot of confusion. One additional problem that we identify is that most existing frameworks for PSS and SEL are Western and have been developed in high income, middle income, and stable societies, but there's really nothing that can be used for the context of conflict and crisis where we work. And because of that, we really wanted to take action. We have seen that the lack of a core framework that identified those key dimensions and skills has led to confusion in the field about what different stakeholders mean when they refer to the things that they want to promote and measure, and to the inability to compare, coordinate, measure PSS and SEL, and to promote interventions and to even conduct research that can strengthen the evidence base. So for this reason, if you can go to the next slide, we set out a project where our goal would be to develop an adaptive core framework for PSS and SEL that creates a shared language and also a set of tools for localization of new frameworks, so that donors, researchers, practitioners, and policy makers can name, invest, measure, research, evaluate, and promote the development of PSS and SEL. By adaptive core, we mean that the framework actually will identify the key dimensions and also the key skills that are relevant for children in context of conflict and crisis, those that seem to be shared across many different frameworks. As part of the process, we'll have identified many existing frameworks, and Stephanie Jones and the Harvard EASEL Lab have already been coding many of them from developing context and usually other contexts that are not from context of conflict and crisis. So in this project, we are specifically going to focus on that, to build on the work that Harvard EASEL Lab has done. And based on the coding of those frameworks and processes of field testing that we'll describe later, we hope to basically identify what are those core dimensions, the very core dimensions, and the skills that are relevant for the field. And also we call it adaptive because we don't expect that it's just going to be like something universal, but that there will still be space and room for further contextualization so that people in different organizations and different contexts can still basically take that core framework and conduct adaptations that are fit for purpose and that are relevant for the context. So that's where we will have both a framework and as tools for further localization of new frameworks that will still keep the connections to a core instrument where people will know what we're all talking about and finding ways to measure it and to coordinate in the field. So the adaptive core framework and the tools for localization will support the development, the implementation, and the assessment of program and policies and research so that all the PSS and SEL activities are effective and they are evidence-driven in crisis context. Our outcomes, Margie, if you go to the next. We expect that the project outcomes will have that we will develop that core adaptive framework and the tools for localization in context of conflict and crisis, and that this will be done through a highly consultative process with local and global stakeholders. And so it's very important that it's highly consultative, and also that it will be built based on an iterative process of field testing in several of the contexts where we work. So it has those two elements. We also hope that the core framework and the tools for localization will lead to improved clarity and increased awareness of PSS and SEL, the competencies and dimensions that are relevant for our field among a variety of stakeholders. And in order to do that, we will be creating maps that clarify the connections between different frameworks, and that will also clarify the process of taking the core framework and conducting further localization. And we also will be, another project outcome will be that high-level stakeholders such as donors and policymakers will adopt and use and uptake the core framework in the context where we work. And so there will be a lot of advocacy activities and a lot of dissemination activities as well. And for us, dissemination doesn't start at the end of the project, but from the very beginning, we'll be including a variety of stakeholders, local and global, to ensure that that their voices are included and that they will uptake and disseminate and adopt the framework. So I think now in order to do this process, we decided to partner with Harvard EASEL Lab. INE, as Margie mentioned, is an organization that already has a lot of members, but we also thought that EASEL Lab would be our perfect partner because they've been also conducting this work in other contexts, and I will pass it to Stephanie so she can describe the work that Harvard EASEL Lab have been doing and explain why they're the best partner for us.
Yes, thank you. I love that ending, the best partner for you, yes. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. So my job is to just sort of describe what we do in the EASEL Lab, which stands for Ecological Approaches to Social Emotional Learning, which in short means that in our lab and in my work as a researcher at Harvard, we do everything related to social and emotional learning, but we take a distinct perspective on the work, that it is deeply ecological and contextual. And so everything we do is really centered on that domain, but in the context of all of the forces that are sort of in settings and in environments and in experiences that influence those kinds of skills and competencies. So I would describe our work as sort of situated in two primary areas, and you can just go forward. Do I control this, or do you, Rachel? Okay, there we go. So one big focus of our work is to build knowledge of human development and context. So we are researchers. I am a developmental psychologist. You can just click all the way through, actually, this one. And the questions that we're focused on are what are the factors in experience and in environments and in contexts that influence children's social, emotional, and behavioral development in and out of school. And we use that information to think about how we might transform settings where children learn and grow, which is really about developing, designing, implementing, testing strategies and practices that are organized around this domain. And what we're focused on there is the question of whether or not the kinds of things we design based on a knowledge base actually influence the outcomes we hope to target. And in doing that kind of cycle of work, we hope to deeply connect evidence to practice and policy, but also learn from practice and policy to continue to grow our knowledge base. So that's kind of what the EASEL Lab does. And the next slide will give you a sense of the kinds of specific areas we work in. So on the left-hand side, at the top, we do developmental research and evaluation research, which is large-scale longitudinal research projects and randomized evaluations of strategies and practices that have been designed by us or by others. And there are a whole host of projects that fit into this category that have been deeply informative for us, and I hope for others in the field, in thinking about the next part of this pie, which is designing strategies and practices for the field. And we do that in partnership with local actors in the US and increasingly around the globe. And in this body of work, we're really focused on innovation in practice. So using what we know to think in creative ways about how we might design strategies, practices, and related policies in a way that is more likely to have an impact on outcomes, both in settings, adult outcomes, environmental outcomes, and for young people, children and youth. We've been thinking in this domain about creative ways to design that can be scaled more effectively than we've seen before. And for those of you who know a little bit about what we do, probably heard about our approach to practice in social emotional learning, which is kind of a kernelized or components kind of approach that we're working with right now. And that's our thinking about the sort of twin challenges in the world of social and emotional learning, which is on the one hand, trying to get to integration into the sort of fabric and practice of schooling. So that's one sort of thing we're trying to solve with a kernel approach. And the other thing we're trying to solve is this question about how do you scale practices in a manner that is both consistent with knowledge and has some fidelity to original practice, but also it's highly adaptable, localizable to different settings. So that's one of the main things that we're doing in that category. And then at the bottom, maybe most relevant to the work of this partnership is what we describe as sort of field building, which is creating for the field that is about the field. So we call that field building, which is writing reports and designing tools that help the field understand itself, communicate about itself, and be in some ways a little more reflective about itself. And in this category, we have done a whole bunch of things with frameworks, as people know, which is trying to get some purchase on the huge breadth and depth of the frameworks, the ways of thinking, the value systems that sit inside the frameworks that define the field broadly. And so in service of that effort, we built a website called Explore-SEL, which is sort of the first instantiation of this kind of coding and linking frameworks that define the field. And that has been a platform for a whole variety of other projects. The INEE Kello project, which is a report that recently came out, and a whole variety of other things sort of rest upon that foundation, which is the website, but also the methods and procedures that we have employed as a kind of starting point to build that work. And a lot of that is what we will draw upon in this particular project. We also write reports about practice. So we have a number of reports that take a similar approach. We sort of distill what effective practices are in this domain. And much of that work has been funded by the Wallace Foundation. And there are reports that we've done for them that are available also online, all of it free and for anyone's use. Margie is super helpfully putting in the chat the website. Okay, so that's really it about the EASEL lab.
Margie, and if you can, would be great if you also add the link to the taxonomy project, and Stephanie, if you say a couple of words about that.
Well, so the Explore SEL website is the sort of culmination of the taxonomy project, which was an effort to code, connect, and reveal connections between the frameworks that define the field to address in some ways this challenge of terminology, with some things being named the same thing but meaning different things, and some things being named different things but meaning the same thing. Like that whole kind of jumble is what we were trying to navigate with the taxonomy project, which resulted in this Explore SEL website. Our goal with that work wasn't, as a starting point, to define a new framework for the field. It was actually to reveal where the field is really deeply connected to each other and where there is opportunity for new connection or innovation. So this project builds on a lot of that work by attempting to use some of those procedures to begin to reveal what is deeply common among the ways of thinking that define our field, but also to connect with that, a kind of set of guidelines or a process for thinking about how to make something deeply local at the same time. So those two ideas, some might say, work in opposition to each other. I would say, I don't think so. I think they actually are deeply complementary, because one presents a starting point and an opportunity for connection, and the other enables that starting point to be deeply relevant to a place and a way of thinking and a set of values and priorities. So that's what we're trying to do with all of this. There is one, for those interested, I think, Sylvia, you could have been referring to this, but the Navigating SEL from the Inside Out report is something, this report we did for the Wallace Foundation that we are doing right now, an update of version for older kids, is kind of a distillation of the strategies and practices that have been used primarily in the US. But we see it as a leaping off point in a similar way for lots of other work. So how's that? Is that okay? Enough of EASEL?
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Oh, and I should also say, on the call, well, I just want to say, I want to introduce my colleague, Sonia Temko, who many people know, who's worked on many of these projects. And we have a kind of a whole long trail of folks who work in the lab who have worked in one way or another on these different projects, and will certainly intersect with it. So thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie, so much for that introduction to EASEL Lab's work. And not to labour the point too much, but Explore SEL is fantastic, just to go and play around and compare different frameworks. So I really highly recommend you checking that out. So this next slide is just to give a visual of how the two partners involved in this project will work together. So on the left-hand side, you have INEE, and the project agreement with the major donor, as Margie mentioned, Porticus Foundation, was signed with INEE. As such, we hold the sort of overall responsibility for delivering on outputs. But this is very much an equal partnership in terms of the work. So INEE, the work will be led by the PSS-SEL collaborative, and some of the sort of tasks and activities that they will be involved in are listed there. So it's really the project management side, the formation of the reference group, the convening of think tanks, and selecting and sort of managing partners during the field testing. And then at the end of the whole project, the dissemination phase. EASEL, on the other hand, INEE through IRC will sign a partnership agreement with EASEL Lab, and they really hold or carry the weight in terms of the development and the technical inputs into this framework and the localizing processes, and then analysing and incorporating all the feedback, whether that's from the think tanks or from the field testing sites. And this sort of squiggly yellow line is indicative of the fact that it is an iterative process, and this goes back and forth between INEE and EASEL, who are in strong communication throughout the project. I'm going to pass over to Julia now, and she's going to talk us through the timeline of the project and picking out some of the key activities that we need to be aware of. Thank you, Julia.
Thanks, Rachel. And as you can see, there's a key that kind of indicates what these colors that you'll see next to certain activities are referring to as far as roles and responsibilities. And I think, you know, in addition to the squiggly line that does show this highly interactive process between INEE and Harvard's EASEL lab, there's also your involvement in this whole process, which is really critical to our success. So if we look sort of at phase 1, where we are right now, we're kicking off this project today, and you know, this first phase is really going to be focused on hearing from practitioners in the field about different frameworks and tools that are being used in EIE contexts to support the development of social emotional learning skills and providing psychosocial support. And really, once those tools and frameworks have been provided, Harvard will kick us off with coding these. And based on this whole coding of these new frameworks, developing our first set of instruments and our first draft of this framework that will then lead to our second phase, which is about convening our first think tank. And this is really where your active participation to review drafts of the frameworks and the tools before we take this work to the field for testing is critical. So if we go, and we'll talk a little bit more about details of the think tanks and groups later on. The third phase will be the actual field testing, where we're really focused on working on the ground through INEE members to hear from local actors, to present these ideas, to have discussions, to ground truth these frameworks and tools, and ensure we're gathering as much feedback as possible from these contexts. The fourth phase will then be revision of the framework and tools based on the results of the field testing, to which we will then move to our second think tank, where we'll have the chance to look at the revised tools and frameworks, discuss, again, your participation will be extremely critical for this, and then moving to the second round of field testing, where we take back these revised tools and materials, again, engaging very heavily through active participation with actors in these contexts. The next phase is, again, that revision process based on feedback from our second round of field work, and then hoping to finalize the adaptive framework and the tools, and then dissemination. But I think, as Sylvia mentioned, dissemination, we really see that as happening throughout the process, given the high level of engagement that we expect from various experts and actors across the field, to ensure that we have, you know, your buy-in, your contributions, and that you feel a sense of ownership throughout this process. We know this is an ambitious timeline. If you see, we're looking to conclude by the end of 2022, but we're very excited to get this started today. And so, yeah, maybe we can go now to the slide for next steps. So, as was mentioned in sort of phase 1, right now we're focused on forming the reference group. And so the goal of the reference group will really be to ensure that the adaptive core framework and the localizing process materials are developed through a very highly consultative process. So we're looking to have about 20 reference group members, which we will talk about a little bit more, I think, probably during the Q&A. We really want to ensure that local actors are a part of this process from the beginning and are very actively involved throughout. So we will be prioritizing the inclusion of those local voices in this process, and also making sure that we reach out to the right people. So really pulling in the experts in this field to participate in this project. And so we're also right now starting to collect some of those additional frameworks from education and emergencies contexts that Harvard has not yet had the opportunity to look at, so that we can then start that whole coding in partnership with the EASEL lab. We really want to focus on tools that have been developed locally. We know that that work has been going on, and so ensuring that they get included in part of this coding and this project. And then also looking at, what are these different frameworks and tools that are used either at a regional level but adapted for different countries, or also globally, but that have that adaptation material as part of it as well. So I think I can stop there and we can open up the floor to any questions that people have.
So just feel free to come off mute to ask your questions directly, or if you prefer, you can write the questions in the chat and we're happy to answer.
Oh, hi, this is Janet Schreiber from Creative. Thanks so much. I have a question. So our locally adapted tools are translated to local languages, and just how is that going to be handled?
I think I'll take that, but Julia and Margie also feel free to jump in. Yes, I mean, we have resources to both translate local frameworks that we identify in the field, that there may be, documents that we need to code, but that are in other languages, and as well as resources to translate the emerging core framework and tools for contextual localization into local languages in 10, 12 countries where we are expecting to do the field testing. Margie, I don't know if you want to.
I think in order for Harvard to be able to code these, right, we will have to ensure that they're translated. But you're bringing up a very good point, because we know sometimes that challenge in getting at what does this concept actually refer to, right? What skill is this getting at? The translation part of that does sometimes make this a little bit more difficult. And so, yeah, that will be important for us to take into consideration as these tools are translated.
Yeah, and just to echo, within INEE, we do have the language community facilitators. Maybe some of them are joining us here. As many of you know, INEE works in 5 different languages. So if the resources are available in any of those languages, we may be able to seek support from our language community facilitators. And INEE also works with Translators Without Borders, who may be able to support with translation of the resources as well. We really want to ensure that that proper translation work is done to be able to capture all of the frameworks that are coming from those local contexts in those languages. So we're very open to receiving those frameworks as well. Sonia, Stephanie, would you like to add anything about that?
No, I mean, I think you guys have covered it. The only thing I would add or emphasize is that represents a challenge, right? A challenge and an opportunity, which is to say that the challenge is to do what one of those folks just said, I think maybe Julia, which is to ensure that meaning is preserved, and meaning is preserved through translation. And that's a sort of a set of procedures and a process that we're, because of our experience in other projects and our sort of early thinking about this project, something that we are keenly aware of, and will hopefully in the early phases of this get some procedures down that allow us to maintain some of that preserving of meaning, but also do the kinds of systematic coding that we need to do to sort of execute this project. So we definitely hear you and are aware, and we'll come up with procedures that we hope will sensitively address this particular issue.
Yeah, and Janet, I think maybe you're familiar as well with the INEE glossary and INEE terminology bank that we have. So the Translators Without Borders group that we're working with to translate INEE resources, they've been working with INEE and have this glossary available. So they're very familiar with education emergencies and humanitarian language, as well as PSS and SEL language. They're the ones that supported the translation of the guidance note and background paper, as well as the module. So hopefully there's some strong components that we've built in with our work with Translators Without Borders in terms of capturing some of the nuances that are particular to PSS and SEL. But yeah, great question. Thank you.
I would like to add, though, that initially and perhaps we didn't emphasize it as much as we should have, but the process, we initially identify as many local frameworks as we possibly can and conduct the translation so that they can be coded. But we also understand that in many of the contexts where we work, there's not like public documents that explicitly discuss all the dimensions and skills and of SEL and PSS and SEL. And so that's why we have an iterative process of field testing, where we will have, after coding some frameworks, we will actually have a first draft of the framework, and then we take that draft and we're going to conduct an in-depth process of field testing, where we gather information from several different stakeholders in 10 to 12 countries to see whether the things that are emerging there resonate, if there's anything that's missing, to further capture the things that are relevant or not for the stakeholders in the context where we work, in ways that may not be available publicly available, but that's why we will collect a lot of additional data from many stakeholders in several contexts to then further refine the framework and come up with a second draft and then a second process of field testing to gather more information. And so all of that obviously requires a lot of translation and translation, but to ensure that the final framework that will capture the things that are relevant for the different communities where we work.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Janet. It was really pertinent, and there's a lot to say about it, and as we've said, a lot to think about. We had a question in the chat from Andrea, and I think this will open up the discussion a bit more about one of the next steps, which is the coding of additional frameworks. So Andrea asks, will SEL frameworks in Ministry of Education, national curricula, in crisis contexts also be a part of this study, or will there be advice about how to intersect with these? Maybe Sonia or Stephanie could take that.
I can start, and Sonia can certainly add, or like retract if I. Yeah, my answer to that is like, yeah. So the more that is included and coded, the stronger the whole system becomes. So, our first phase is to do this kind of broad sweeping or gathering to acquire, to find, to build the body of materials that we're going to code. So I would say yes, wholeheartedly yes to that. Sonia?
Yeah, I would say absolutely, to the extent that they're available, which we know
Right.
is pretty limited. But as part of the field testing process, we are hoping to engage, Ministry of Education level stakeholders.
And I think, yeah, it's just a good time to say again that if what I can do is share with the participants of this call the list of already coded frameworks, but we are making a call for anyone in this call, especially collaborative members, to share with us any frameworks, or even if that's parts of curriculum, national curriculum, so that they can be coded in this initial part, because of course the more frameworks that are coded, the richer this project will be. Do we have any more questions?
Hi, everyone. This is Nikhit from the University of Notre Dame. Good to be on the call. Hi, Stephanie. So I think one question I have, and I'm struggling with how to actually frame it, and so maybe you guys can help me with it. And I think it's related to this endogeneity issue, in that the frameworks that are currently used, or a lot of them, have been influenced by kind of Western paradigms. And then we're taking and analyzing those frameworks. And so what will end up being prioritized or weighted heavily will be Western paradigms. And so how will you manage the kind of weighting or prioritization in the process of thinking through this kind of adaptive framework? And maybe a kind of a follow-up question to that will be, when we think of kind of the landscape of PSS-SEL, most of the conversations that I have is around kind of SEL, civic moral education, life skills, soft skills, character education, 21st century skills. And so in thinking of kind of the development or age range related to the framework, how will that be incorporated into thinking about an adaptive framework?
Okay, so I'll start because I can't help myself. You raised two critical questions, and hello, how are you, Nick? It's so great to hear your voice, I have to say. You raised really important questions, and I would say, yes, I would call it, I might not call it endogeneity, although maybe I would. I'd probably call it tautology, which is that we're starting with something to create something that just recreates the thing we started with. And you're right, that is an absolute challenge with this project. And I would say at the start, we have considered those challenges, and that has gone into sort of our design thinking about how we could execute a project like this in order to nudge into the moments or have opportunities to step back and say, how much are we simply reflecting the material that we started with by cycling through iterations of coding, field testing, recoding, redoing, field testing, recoding, redoing, field testing. So we expect those iterations to help in some ways with that challenge, although I acknowledge fully that that may not be enough. I also think as we design our system, we'll have to do some things that we haven't quite done before with Explore SEL, although in the backdrop, like the data that are sitting behind that whole system do have this information in it, which is to sort of trace the intellectual history of the framework to the degree that we can, so that as we are doing our sort of synthesis analytic kind of work with the coded data, we can incorporate something that reflects the intellectual the sort of pathway to where it is of the framework, its intellectual history or its governance or its location, something related to that. So that's one thing. But I invite anybody on the rest of anybody in the group to respond as well. To your second question, which is like, how do we acknowledge and reflect the sort of age or grade, the age-based or grade genesis of certain ways of thinking, like social emotional learning largely comes from kind of primary school thinking and period of human development, whereas positive youth development typically, or civics education typically comes from the sort of youth adolescent period. Those are also constructs and variables that we'll have to track and include in our synthetic analytic work. Although, it is something that we'll have to think about. Do we have some variants of a core that are age-based and some guidelines about adaptation or localization that take into consideration age, sort of setting, and some other features that are important. So great questions. I hope someone's writing all this down. Can we record this? Yes, it's being recorded.
It's being recorded, yes. Oh, Nikki just asked a question in the chat about sending frameworks. I would say send them to me and I'll send them on to EASEL. I'm going to share my email in the chat just now so anyone can flag frameworks to us.
Yeah, and I also wanted to offer an opportunity here. We will soon be reaching out to many of you to join our reference group, which we're hoping will be sort of a guiding body to support us throughout the process, providing technical input and guidance throughout the process, as well as supporting us with convening the think tanks and the field testing as well. So we're looking to convene about 25 members, and the profile we're seeking is individuals who are field level practitioners, local stakeholders, researchers and academics, as well as donors and strategic thinkers. So if there's any questions about joining the reference group or what the commitment looks like, please feel free to ask. We do have some time during this call to answer some of those questions. On the call here, we have many collaborative members as well as potential reference group members who we'd love to bring on board. So any questions about that, please do feel free to ask as well.
I think also if you have any recommendations of people that may not be on this call right now or who perhaps are not on our radar but you think would be critical voices to become part of the reference group, if you could please also perhaps share that suggestion with Rachel, that would be much appreciated.
I can also share the TOR for the reference group with everybody after this call so that you can think about who might best fit. Yeah, so I think that answers your question, Nikit.
And we do expect for the reference group, like to join us in calls and provide feedback throughout the process, but also we're conducting the think tanks with some stakeholders that will help us a lot with the strategic thinking. And because it's so important for us to really ensure that we have local stakeholders as well, that people that, and perhaps from organizations or from contexts that may not have resources to come to the think tanks, we have actually we have resources to bring them. It's for us, the local stakeholders' participation in the think tanks and reference groups is highly important, and so we have secured the funding for that.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Sylvia. I think that addresses some of the challenges, Nikit, that you were talking about as well. We're really hoping to be able to, ease some of the financial burdens that might come with participating and being convened in such a forum. So. Yeah, and I think Dean is on the line, and as Dean would say, INEE is really its members. So we really need support from all of you to be able to make sure that we do this project well and we do it thoughtfully. So your contributions are very, very important to us.
Do we have any more questions or even comments, concerns, things that have come up for you during this call? If that's it for questions, perhaps we'd be glad to get 10 minutes back into our day, as we've all been on a lot of calls recently. So I want to thank you all again for joining. We really appreciate your interest in this project. Following the call, we will share with you the recording, the slides from this call, as well as the TOR for the reference group, so you can start thinking about possible reference group members, and the list of frameworks that have already been coded, so you can also start to think about additional frameworks for coding. Feel free to send me an email if anything comes up, and we really look forward to working with all of you on this project. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Stefan, everyone.